I saw this article today about Brown's University interface. They've been doing a lot of work in this area. Some of you may have seen the work they did. There was a story, this was last year. They have this technology called BrainGate where they had a paralysed woman who was able to control the robot arm from her brain signals. And what's quite fascinating about this is they use a very small chip, see compared to the coin here, which is implanted in the brain and tethered into this robot arm. But what they're showing today, remember I showed you last week the mice sending the signals. We discussed that, yeah, now it's working wirelessly. So they put this tiny chip in there and you can control something remotely. Again, they've done lots of experiments on animals with this, but now they're looking at putting it into humans. Very low power, very tiny little wireless devices in the brain, allowing you to potentially control some augmentation or robotic signal. So I was pretty interested to read about this today. Quite an interesting technology. But the one I really wanted to show you was this article, literally only came out yesterday, and it's a Polish guy interviewing this guy Stella we've been talking about in this magazine Quietus. And I sat and read this. I read this article this morning, this interview, and all I kept thinking while I was reading it was, oh wow, Patrick talked about that. Oh wow, Patrick talked about that. You know, all the things we've done in class are in this article, and I think it really grounded that everything we've been talking about is in here. So I just wanted to have a look at this. He introduces Stella, who he is, and the kind of crazy stuff he does, and then the very first question they ask him is, do you believe in the existence of souls, ghosts, or any metaphysical presence that can enter our bodies? And he says, I guess more and more performances, the more I think I have no mind of my own, nor any mind at all in a traditional metaphysical sense. And so immediately starts this discussion we had in the last class about the metaphysical sense of grounding technologies in the present, which we talked about just in the last class. And then when we look at this body, physical, phenomenological, operating, interactive body, this body is totally obsolete and empty. There is nothing inside my head. What is important is not what's inside you or me, but what is happening between people in the medium of language that we use to communicate, in the social institutions in which we operate, and in the culture that we've been conditioned to inhabit. It's a Western metaphysical assumption to imagine that there is something inside our bodies. With Plato, it was a homunculus in the beginning. In Christian theology, of a soul within our body. With Descartes, the mind was a different substance from the brain. Freud distinguished ego and superego as a way of explaining the internal motivations and repressed behaviours of the body. I feel that it's unnecessary to construct anything that's internal. It's the interaction in personal and social spaces that constructs what it means to be human. We're human because of our social systems, our technologies, and our culture. We're human precisely because we have neither mind nor a soul. Well, what I liked about this was I kind of went through all the things Patrick's talked about in class, exactly the same way, this kind of development through history of what it means to be human. And Stella now has this idea that transcends many of those things. Anyone want to comment on that quickly before we move on to the next one? On Tom?
I guess I'd say that this probably is going to be covered by my group's project. For my end, I'd like to present Ghost in the Shell as a perfect example of that of flying right in the face of what Stella was saying. 'Cause that's a film where I know that yes, it is science fiction, but that argues that the last bit of humanity that Major Kusanagi has is the mind or soul or what have you, the ghost within her cyborg body. So, no. I like
But
to
we
agree with
need
Mama
to-
Roshi on that.
While using some cultural reference of either a movie or a novel or some work of fiction as an example, we need to have a grounded argument in the kind of academic literature to back that up, not just saying it's in a movie.
Yeah.
You need something a little more grounded. Matt?
It says that we're human because of our social system, our technology, and our culture. So what happens if there's a person that's on an island and doesn't have any of that? Do they cease to be human? You know what I mean? Like, what about the thing inside that you communicate with yourself? You know what I mean? Like, what is that?
I think you still have an interaction with your environment. He's saying he defines who you are. He's talking about this. You'll see he talks about this a little bit more further down. What he's really talking about is our sensory interaction with our environment, as well as, you know, he expands on that a little bit further down. But sorry, at the back before you, Katie.
Brian, it sounds
Brian.
like he's saying that what makes us human is our sort of delusion that we could be anything but human. I mean, like, you know, we have a mind because we think we can have a mind, rather than, you know, any sort of actual presence of the mind, which is what he's saying is the more he performs these experiments and does all these augmentations to himself, the less he thinks that he has a mind in the traditional sense of us thinking we should have a mind. He's just there.
Yeah. He's changed his perception of himself through his experimentation with his body, which I find really fascinating. And I'm not saying I fully agree with his interpretation, but I find his take on this whole subject fascinating. Or Katie was first, I remember.
Oh, I was just going to bring up, I'm teaching Frankenstein in one of my classes, and of course, like the same kind of thing, you know, a guy creates artificial intelligence out of reanimated corpse parts.
I'd argue that Frankenstein isn't an artificial intelligence. We'll go on.
Okay, yeah, I know. We're having that sort of conversation as well, but it just reminded me that we're talking about what construes being monstrous and what is being human in the book. And this one of my students said that being human is basically because of the relationships people have with each other. And so that's, I mean, yeah.
It's saying the same thing.
Yeah.
And Frankenstein's a whole interesting one, but you know, I'd argue Frankenstein is human, brought back to life. It's still human. I would argue it's still human. We have that, you know, zombification with getting lots of people. So Aaron was next.
So yeah, I like how he kind of shuns the whole mind and soul kind of visage for a more realistic interpretation, but I feel like he doesn't go far enough, and that he's kind of adopting the standard social science model, where he stresses the immediate causes of our actions, but he's not thinking about the evolutionary history of us as a species. That every human on this planet has at least one thing in common, and that's that we share millions of years of the same evolutionary history, basically, and that if anything's going to bind us and has shaped the very ability to have social interactions in a social world, about which the standard social science model talks about, the ability to even have that to begin with came from the evolutionary processes that shaped our brains and our bodies.
Yeah.
So I feel like that's a huge etiological root that's missing.
If any of you haven't seen it, I only watched it the other day. Have you heard of the movie Cave of Forgotten Dreams? Werner Herzog. It's Werner Herzog, who's a filmmaker. He makes fictional movies as well, but he also makes documentaries. And he's made some brilliant documentaries. He made Grizzly Man about the guy who went to live with the bears and then got eaten by the bears. But he's, this one, Cave of Forgotten Dreams, he was let into the cave in France, which has the oldest cave paintings in the world. And because they're so valuable, no one's let in there, ever, because he damages them so much. And he was let in there for 5 days, and he filmed these paintings that are 35,000 years old, the oldest representations of art. And he gives this kind of very philosophical conversation about what those paintings mean to us as a species, who we are as humans, and what these are. And it is just, there's some crazy interviews with hippie archaeologists as well. But apart from that, the document...
It's a beautiful film.
It's a beautiful film, and it really makes you think about who we are as a species and what media means to us as a species, why we paint and why these things are important. So I only saw it the other day, and it's almost a changing film, isn't it? To see. It really makes you think, wow, this is who we are, you know.
And this is who we have been.
This is who we have been. And the fact that you think about 2,000-3,000 years ago, the Egyptians, and we think of them as so different to us. Imagine what we were like 35,000 years ago. And what he's saying is we weren't that different. You know, so it's quite an astonishing thing. Well worth looking up.
Is it on Netflix?
It's on Netflix, yeah. Apparently it's available in 3D, and most film critics said it's one of the most beautiful 3D films you can ever watch. But I didn't get to see it in 3D at the cinema, I saw it on Netflix. So. But yeah, sorry, Anthony, you were next. So.
We've been kind of getting around to it, but I think I'm not really interested in his assertions about the mind and the soul, but rather about the networking aspect of humans.
Yeah, the social and sensitive.
I think if you look at like human interaction, and if you want to think of, if you want to think in terms of the mind about human interaction, there's a bunch of people who talk about kind of social structure and what comes out of it, you know, what emerges out of it. Holland was one guy who talked about like the shape of, you know, cities and stuff and how the whole thing is organic.
Holland, which Holland?
John Henry Holland.
Yeah, so the guy who did the network.
Well, and that ties in with, you know, all the other kind of organic stuff that he did, you know, sharing algorithms, all that. But when he's talking about systems, and stuff that rises out of systems, because of like social interaction and stuff, you know, what's that emergent stuff at the top? That's society. You know, what are we?
Well, that work was carried on by Susan Greenfield in her work in the Society of Mind, and the fact that the mind is in the parallels with the society. Yeah, Holland did Holland did a lot of work in associative networks where pattern recognition, but also he was very interested in the fact that the way the brain is organised, societies can organise in similar ways. Self-organisation.
What's his first name?
John Holland.
John, not Norman.
No, John Holland. He did. So he's a very interesting guy, a biologist who became a neuroscientist and a computer scientist. Developed some of the earliest neural network models in some ways. Yeah, he had an interesting life. Tom.
What I'd ask is, what would he define as a mind that we do not have?
Who? Are we talking about Holland or
Stellar. Because the way I see it, I mean, if you want to get really technical, the mind could be called like the result of various neuronal processes being carried out in the brain, right? I mean, that's how neurotransmitters help us make us feel certain emotions based on their levels. If we want to if we really want to go down a route like that, we can say that the mind is just those different reactions and responses being, you know, made into one continuous. If we want to approach it from a bottom-up perspective, like, couldn't we see the mind as that?
Well, he's removing that in many ways. He's moving away from that definition.
Well, I guess what I'm trying to say is, because we know that stuff goes around in the brain, I mean, I'm not sure if it's mincing words or not, but isn't that basically saying that we have, that we do have a mind because it's
Do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I think that's why last class Patrick was discouraging us from defining things and encouraging us to describe things instead. Because, I mean, sure, you can reduce mind to essentially a meaningless definition if you want, and therefore claim that Stoic's not saying anything meaningful. But I don't think that's really, I think that's missing the point of the interview question and answer.
I see what Stellark is doing is that he is listing many of the definitions Patrick has talked about in class and the history Patrick's taken us through of Freud, Descartes, and the metaphysical grounding that has happened in the past. And Stellark is kind of, I read it as saying, I feel we are moving beyond those now into something else and becoming something else. And I read it as that. And I'm not saying I fully agree with it, but I think it's challenging. He's challenging its established views. And he challenges it with his artwork, he challenges it with his public declarations and these sorts of things.
Right.
So we'll finish with Brian, then we'll have to
I'll
move
make a
on.
quick point.
Come Brian,
Go ahead,
just,
Brian
Brian's the
first,
last one. So.
But just to respond to the question, this is how we define mind. He says, doesn't he say specifically, he's moving away from how the mind soul thing is defined in the traditional metaphysical sense?
Yeah.
So it is defined.
Yeah.
okay.
If I'm reading it right, so he says, we have these older ways of talking about the body and the mind. And what we're discovering is that those older ways of talking aren't really working for us anymore. So they worked for a while, this concept of a soul that's inside a body, that was very meaningful for a lot of our ancestors. But it's a vocabulary that's breaking down in our own contemporary moment. So, but nevertheless, if you look at his own comment, he has to use phrases that are still wrapped up in this idea that there's something inside a body, and that there's some way we can divide, find a place where the inside is no longer inside, and it becomes outside, or vice versa. So he still is caught up in he's very much a person of our own moment here. So he redeploys this notion of the personal and the social. Well, what's the personal? In traditional language, the personal is what's inside. It's somewhere between what's inside and what's my body. And my body sort of is both inside and outside, isn't it? So you see the outside of my body, sort of.
It's next sentence.
Right, there we go.
It's difficult with language. As soon as you say my body, it means there is someone who is me, and there is something that is my body.
Right, and so, but even Freud in the psychoanalytic tradition is going to say that the emergence of that notion of the ego, right, is a development out of basic biological processes, and that then it somehow acquires or falls into language. So even the psychoanalytic model is one that's going to indicate that there's a kind of arbitrary relationship between saying I and this biological entity that I am, this living organism that I am. So the psychoanalytic model actually can account for the, so to speak, the arbitrary or the artificial nature of the ego. There are many traditions within psychoanalysis. Some of them reinforce the ego. They think of the ego as somehow essential for personality development. But the Lacanian tradition within psychoanalytic theory thinks about the ego as something that's mad. The ego is mad is a kind of a standard cliche that we use when we're talking about Lacanian psychoanalysis. So that would indicate, just to show you quickly how there's kind of a sympathetic understanding here, that if you say me, right, that it's some kind of a deception,
Yeah.
if you will.
And I think that's what he's saying in some way.
Yeah.
I get that.
And I think Katie's been pointing out in her posts and so on that, well, there's a tradition within Buddhism too that thinks about the ego as some kind of a delusion. I'm reading some of your comments right. So, but it helps to realize that. So once he says this language doesn't work for us anymore, then Stellark too has got this problem where in order to kind of say what he's after he reinstates the personal and the social. Right? But instead he's thinking about these things as something like networks. Probably.
Technology.
Right.
And technology.
So now what I like about the last statement in that is that it resorts to negation. So he says we're human precisely because we have neither a mind nor a soul. And what you can see happening there is this is the structure of the semiotic square. This is why that semiotic square is so powerful. Because we might say that one of the things that makes us human, okay, so some people think we're human because we have a soul, right? And what's the opposite of soul? Well, some people think we're human because we have a body. And so the people that think we're human because we have a body, they're the people that privilege the, say, evolution and biological knowledge about defining our nature. People that say that we have a soul, they're the people that talk about how we're irrational. We have this capacity for reason given to us by God and all that. So what he's basically doing is saying this traditional definition of what it means to be human, that's not where we are. In our own historical moment, our computer science and our technology is teaching us that we are non-soul, right, and non-body. So what he's done in terms of the semiotic structures, he's shifted the place of the definition, so to speak. He's saying whatever it is that we are not this and not that. Right? We are the negation of soul and the negation of body. And what does that really tell us? This tells us that these concepts of soul and body aren't working for us anymore. Okay?
Yeah.
Now, the old word for person, if you said in the 18th century, he offended, he committed an offense against my person, that use of the word would mean body. So if you have something on your person, right, let's say the cops find a controlled substance on you, right, they might say he was carrying this controlled substance on his person.
Mm-hmm.
So person, in a way, is a word that has these old connotations of body, right? And so Stark is completely free from, and he would admit this, I think. I don't think I'm saying anything that would disagree with.
Well, he says it's difficult with language. He struggles because he has to express things with language. I got that throughout the piece, that he was struggling, he was constrained by language with what he wanted to say.
We have to use the words that are available to us.
And language perpetuates Cartesian theory, this dualism. We're stuck with this because of the language. And so this article, I was reading this interview, and everything about it was just reinforcing things we talked about, or challenging things we talked about in class. So the very next one is talking about the body, the use of Platonic significance, or Foucaultian means of controlling the body. They talk about him using the body as a place of experimentation, and immediately they say that. He talks about the problems of language. He knows he's got problems expressing this. The best way to say it is that the body is the means of expression, experimentation, and experience. Convenient material to experiment with itself. I found all sorts of things in here that were just fascinating in terms of what we've been talking about. He talks about the ethical, we've talked about the ethical and sociological implications of this, especially, putting the ear. He's had surgeons building this ear on his arm. What he hasn't done yet, which he's going to do, he's going to insert a microphone into the ear, which will have a wireless transmitter, and you can listen to whatever he's hearing over the internet. So he'll have a third ear that is a public ear for everyone to hear. I think it's brilliant. What a great idea. And the very fact it's shaped like an ear.
So so it would actually become more like a mouth instead of an ear?
No, an ear. Well, will only hear. It will take sound in.
So it's not a mic, it's a speaker? Or
Oh, sorry. Not a mic.
That's a microphone.
No, a microphone. Yeah, it will hear the sound. Not a speaker.
Okay, right, not a speaker.
It will collect sound from the outside world and then transmit it. Yeah, through the internet. So what is happening is, if you think of our ears, the sound comes in and connects to our brain. The sound goes in and connects to the internet and goes out.
I tend to think of a microphone as something that connects to a speaker. Right?
No, it connects to the internet.
Yeah.
But it's like an ear connecting to a brain that connects to the internet.
Okay, I don't get it. Why not just walk around with a microphone attached to you?
Because this has more significance.
Art.
Art and significance. It has significance. The very fact you shaped it into an ear makes it an ear. You know, it's a...
It's kind of arbitrary to me.
So it's not really an ear. It's like an ear.
But he's well,
He's had the skin on his arm sculpted through surgery to form an ear on his arm. It's not an ear that's been transplanted on. He's had surgery to sculpt his own skin on his arm into an ear. So it took him a long time to find surgeons who would do that to him, for all sorts of reasons. So.
Did he ever talk about how he settled on an ear and not some other body part?
He's done he talks about the cyberpunk movement. This one is about two different kind of evolutions of cyberpunk technology where we incorporate technology into our body, so putting the circuit boards, the example I just showed from Brown, and the other one talking about the idea of ghosts in networks, you know, these idea and predictions. And he again talks about this idea of contestable futures, the multiplicity of different bodily constructs, alternate cyborg constructs. Instead of a cyborg resulting from some kind of medical military idea of a traumatized body which we reconstruct using technology and a prosthetic arm, a robotic prosthetic arm, he said we can simply think of amplifying or extending the body with its internet connectivity. And this is something he's very interested in, that his ear connects to the internet. He's had his body parts connected to internet servers where people have control of his body over the internet. So this task envelope where the body performs beyond the boundaries of its skin and the local space that it inhabits. So the fascinating concepts he talks about. Let me jump forward. I advise you all to read this. It's quite fascinating, the things he talks about. Let me jump forward. So some of his suspensions. He actually hasn't done suspensions for a number of years and did one last year. Yeah.
I've been bugging me about Stellar and his project. Like, I think they're interesting and all, but it seems if part of his argument is that it's not our body that makes us human, that's only realized it's only part of it. That is what he's saying, right? Mm-hmm. Then why does he focus so much on things that are human in form? Like his microphone thing has to be shaped like a human ear, or his extra arm has to be shaped like a human arm with a hand.
Well, he doesn't necessarily. He's had the big skeleton robot abstraction. He's had the virtual avatars, some of which in human form, like the head we saw talking, some of which aren't in human form. He's done both. So, yeah. But I think the very fact it looks like an ear is quite a statement. It makes quite a statement about itself. But yes, I agree. It doesn't necessarily, as Patrick said, the same, why a human ear, why not another body part? It doesn't have to be.
Well, not even why a body part at all. Like, why anything that's human in form at this point is that that's not our body that makes us human.
It's a valid question, and all of these are questions to be asked of it. I think so, yeah.
Because of the interactions that it has with other people.
Yeah.
Its representation of it.
Yeah, people see that ear on an arm, it has an immediate impact on an arm. You have a reaction to that, which is one of the things I personally believe. Art should be about reaction. And a way, it should be, whether it's an emotional reaction, some form of response. And that generates a response, a very strong response in many people. You may hate it, but it generates a response. Tom?
So with what he's talking about the interaction between people being sort of like, that's why we're human as opposed to mind or soul. Like the fact that we can interact, that's what I'm getting the understanding of what he's saying. Is that sort of like, could we say that like, because with the advent of things like the internet and social media, where everybody is communicating with each other online, be they local, knowing each other locally or otherwise, Does the internet and other such things make us, quote unquote, more human? Or, like, by his definition? Or by his general, what he says, general idea of
I
what?
don't think that's quite it. I think he's saying that that kind of social and the network and the interaction is what we are as humans, not that it makes us more humans. That's a separate definition, but it's a potential definition, yes. And it's one of the things we're talking about in this class, and we'll touch on more with the when we come to the online representations about how we extend ourselves as our characters, ourselves, our individuality over into virtual space, or into narrative space, is the next part of the discussion. But yeah, that's a slightly different discussion, I think. But yeah.
I guess in response to you, Tom, about the social interactions and whether or not this makes us human, I'm wondering if it's the desire for social interaction. Because, like, I'm going to talk about Frankenstein again, because this idea of a reanimated corpse, right? So Frankenstein isn't able to have these social interactions that he wants to have. And so he feels alienated.
He doesn't
Like,
get invited to parties.
he doesn't get invited to parties because he's a reanimated corpse.
Yeah.
You know? His form is not what we know. As
You should go to Philip's parties, you know, zombie parties. But yeah, because
And so, but he wants to be. Yeah, he wants to be interacting, right? But he isn't able to. So by that definition, that he's not able to participate in culture or have social interactions, he wouldn't be human.
well, the scientific definition for that, which you may have seen, is the very famous uncanny valley curve, which has kind of human here and kind of machine robot here, which is completely abstract here. And this is, we call it familiarity, but it's how much we like something. And so if you have a robot in a factory that makes cars that doesn't look like anything, we're quite comfortable with that, it's a robot. If we have cuddly toys, or we like them. And the thing about cuddly toys is, as they get more human, things like Disney animations, Lion King, things like that, we get really comfortable around here. Then all of a sudden we have this big drop. Here we have real humans. And we have this big drop, and it's things like, the obvious ones, zombies, reanimated corpses, things that are almost human but not. But also there are prosthetic limbs. Most people, when they see someone with an artificial arm, aren't comfortable with it. You know, and George Bush is standing here as well. But, you know, the other one that's near there is little characters like Polar Express. You know, the feature where they try to make something look real and it doesn't quite look real. You know, a lot of people don't like that movie because it freaks them out a little bit. It's not really enough. Just that little bit where it's looking real, then it suddenly shifts and isn't quite real. People are uncomfortable. So this is a kind of famous scientific. It was developed from robotic theory, but it's now used a lot in computer-generated graphics, and it's been tested many, many times.
Can we get some readings on this?
There are lots of readings on this, yeah. Sure.
Lots of videos too.
Yeah, I'll put something up on Uncanny Valley. Yeah, obviously it's called the Uncanny Valley because you have this drop, so this is where things get uncanny in the valley.
Right.
And so anyone developing any kind of, if you're developing a movie and you're using computer graphics, it's usually you decide to go like The Incredibles or something with a cartoon, because you know that's what it'll work. Or you make something where you use live action and maybe augment it, like Avatar, where people will notice. Or what you don't want to do is drop down either side of this. Yep.
Does he say that we don't have an ego, or that our communication creates the ego?
I don't know. I don't know the answer.
Does it spell out in this answer?
Yeah.
Because to me, if you're interacting with people that affirms your ego, that definitely has an impact on how you view yourself.
As an individual. I think what he's saying is that his perception is that the ego is now a distributed concept. Would you say so, Patrick?
Yeah, I think that's one way to say it. I think he's saying that this old way of describing ourselves doesn't really work anymore. If you think of the ego as something inside of you, right? There is no inside of you, is what he's saying. So the problem isn't so much, the larger point that he's making in that paragraph isn't that there is or isn't an ego, it's that there's no internal, there's no inside to our humanity, right? No matter how we imagine it, whether it's an ego or a soul or a mind, right? These are words that work for us once, but we really kind of use them in the way we kind of felt like we know what we're talking about. But the minute we start to think about, well, what is a mind? What is an ego? What is a soul? If we're honest, we really don't know what we're talking about. So the words like ego, mind, and soul are placeholders from the position that Stellar's standing in, right? They were kind of keeping a sight open. We'll get back to that idea when we have a minute. We'll think about what we mean by mind. Now, one other quick point, and then I'll turn this over to those of you who want to talk. Remember, there are two big ways we can think about what we're doing when we're talking. We can think that we're representing something. So when I say I have a soul, or I've got a big ego, or you hurt my ego, right? If I say things like that, you could think that I'm kind of representing a state that sort of exists somewhere. Right? But that's not really what's happening from Stellar's point of view. I'm actually using those words, but I'm doing something when I use those words. Right? It's not that I'm just following a pre-existing state, because that seems to be not the case. But if I say, I feel like I have an ego, well, what's more important there is actually what I'm doing by asserting that, rather than whether it is or isn't the case. So I become a little bit different if I think of myself differently, and maybe I interact with other people in the network differently. If I think maybe I shouldn't be so self-centered, right? Maybe I should try to see things from somebody else's point of view. Well, that's kind of an internal discussion I might think I might be having with myself. What's important there is not that it's describing some state of being, right? What's important there is it's allowing me to move around. It gives me greater mobility in this network. Does that work for you? That way of thinking about it? So if we emphasize the performative aspects of speech rather than the representational or modeling aspects of speech, I think we begin to catch the difference.
To the idea that the ego is a placeholder for what we don't know, Freud uses it, I think, as something that you move through to get to the superego socially in a network. So if those factors that contribute to the development of language are removed, as in the case of Matt's comment before, or enhanced, as in the case of Tom's comment about the internet, what happens to the presence of the superego, and then what would we revert back to the idea of moving through the ego?
I'm not sure I'm following your question yet. Try it one more time.
Well, I'm thinking of it as in terms of kind of a directionality from the chemistry of an individual to seeing themselves in relation to others with the development of a superego. So if those factors are removed, other people, for example, say you're on a desert island,
Okay.
or they're enhanced, and Tom was indicating that maybe you become more human by those being enhanced. Do either of those factors ever remove, once the language is acquired, do those factors, does a superego ever go away, or since you're always conscious of that presence somewhere, it might not be apparent?
I think Stellar's arguing that the superego, now the ego is more merged into the superego.
This is actually a very difficult question to answer quickly. I think I may have to back up a step or two. I'm not sure I'm fully grasping. There are a couple ways to think about this. But before we do, Anthony, you've been wanting to jump in. So.
It's probably if you change it, so.
Can you remember
yeah.
your point? Okay. Let me just try it, see if, I'll back up for a second and see if this works. What are id, ego, and superego for Freud? Okay. In other words, what are these things? well, some people might call them things faculties of the psyche or something like that. But Freud actually, at the end of his career, when he was dying of throat cancer, Freud started a manuscript that he never completed. It's published as a little book called An Outline of Psychoanalysis. And he says, what have I done with my life? What's the nature of my accomplishment? And remember, he started out he wanted to be a research scientist. He wanted to study neurological structures. And he started working on eels. And he said, I really started out as a research scientist, and what psychoanalysis is, my great achievement is, Freud argues, in this book, is that he's put psychoanalysis on a scientific footing, that he's created a new science that he calls psychoanalysis. Now, you don't have to accept these arguments. I'm talking about Freud's own understanding of what he had accomplished. Remember, he's writing in 1938. So he says, there's something that we know for certain. Have I done this already in this class?
You've mentioned this.
There's something that we know for certain, right? And there's something that is self-evident. What's self-evident as our memories, our dreams, our thoughts, our immediate feelings, anything in our realm of experience that is just immediate. The certain is that the brain and the central nervous system are somehow connected to this self-evident stuff. And he says, we've got to figure out what it is that links these two things together. So he says, let's come up with a hypothesis for the connections between the immediacy of phenomenal experience, memories and so on, speech and so on, and the brain and the central nervous system. So he created the different models of this hypothesis. This is more or less the second one that he arrives at and develops. The first one had to do with the pre-conscious, the conscious, and the unconscious systems. So what's important to realize in this discussion is that what Freud is saying is that when the organism that we all start out as, these dividing cells that develop and so on, when that emerges, it develops, it gradually is this entity that has internal processes, and it's also kind of receiving external pressures and excitations. And so something like a membrane develops, and then out of this, the ego emerges. And then he says so the phrase that he uses in Beyond the Pleasure Principle is, where id was, this would be, so the first step in the development, where id was, there ego shall be. And so ego emerges out of it. It's just think in terms of simple biological processes, right? Our perceptual apparatus develops, and then so we begin to have the capacity to hear and to see. Something, well, sight might not be the best thing, because I'm not an embryologist. I wish I were, but I'm not an embryologist. So, but just think in terms of embryology, and you'll have a sophisticated understanding of this. So at some point then, the ego is also going to be acting on the id as the ego develops. But then with the acquisition of language, when the infant acquires language, the mechanism of the ego and the id operates on the superego, but the superego also operates back. So you have these complex reciprocal processes. So if that's the case, I'm not sure then how I'd answer Taylor's question. Right? But I think in part what I'd say is it's merely a fantasy to imagine that you could have a person living alone on an island. That's not how we find people in the world. The fantasy of a person living alone on an island is a story that's told in fiction. It was one of the first novels ever written, Robinson Crusoe. And what we often say about Robinson Crusoe is that it's a capitalist fantasy, right? It begins as a slave narrative, actually. But anyway, and then turns into a slave narrative again. Am I making some sense? Is this speaking to the question that you're asking more generally? So now what would Stellark say about all this? Stellark would, I think if I'm understanding, Stellark would say and that all of this discussion, right, is operating inside of certain preconceptions that aren't working for us anymore. Right? So it's okay if we resort to this vocabulary, but we just need to be aware that we're resorting to this vocabulary. But this vocabulary is failing us.
Well, the next question kind of talks about this sensory apparatus a little bit, because the very next question they ask him about the concept of artificial intelligence, which is what we've been talking about this start of the course, and he says, what we have to remember is to be an intelligent agent, whatever kind of agent you are, and he talks about this idea of virtual human animal, which seems like he's pulling them arbitrarily out, but you have to be embodied in some physical way and embedded in the world. So when agent, whether it's an artificial agent or you have a physical embodiment, able to interact, operate, manipulate, navigate, it doesn't make sense to have an intelligent agent somehow disembodied and disconnected from its environment. And this made me think of Galatea, of course, when I was reading this, and the discussion in there about this very concept. And he also talks about historically the early AI researchers in the 60s had these views of disembodied artificial intelligence, which weren't physically possible. So it was, he's talking about exactly the same things we've covered in class. Kurzweil, he not a big fan. He thinks his predictions are simplistic and speculative. Projection of Frankenstein. So you see, everything we're talking about in class comes up here. And Faustian anxieties. Possibility that robots will develop agency, therefore autonomy. It doesn't say intelligence or consciousness. They may develop an antagonism, but, you know, again, it's very careful about language. And then, of course, there are discussions about ethical boundaries, which we've talked about in class. And so on. And then he goes on to some of his later projects. But I didn't really want to go much further, but I just wanted to bring this up in class because it seemed to encapsulate many of the very discussions we're having really, really well, and in a very current form. This was only published yesterday. So picks up those arguments quite well. Any last comments before we move into talking about your projects for the rest of the class? Matt, go on.
So he's basically trying to say there's like no definitive origin as far as like having a soul or mind, or I mean, is that what he's trying to say? So I would wonder, I would like to ask him, you know, is it possible to completely reprogram a person? You know, could we reprogram?
I don't think he's answering. He's very careful when he answers these questions not to say yes, we'll create an artificial intelligence. He talks very. His language is very.
I don't mean like artificial. I'm not talking about that. I mean like. All right, there's no mind, there's no soul. The id, ego, and superego are failing to describe.
Well, he may not even be saying there's no mind or soul. He may be saying those words don't describe what we are. I think that's more likely to be the thing he's saying, rather than he's not saying that. He's saying these things don't describe us anymore.
He did in one line say that we are human because we don't have a mind or soul.
Yeah.
So he did actually.
He does say.
I can't wrap my head around it because I'm Matt. There's something definitive about me and my personality. When you meet me and you get to know me and we hang out, I'm distinctive between everyone else you know. That's how you know me. And if I change my name John, you know what I mean? I'm still me. You know what I mean? And I think that's true for everyone. You know, and we're all definitive in our own ways, and all express in our ways, and that doesn't really seem to change. I mean, I'm still kind of the same person I was when I was a teenager.
But he's saying that definition, that thing that defines you is your senses and your interaction with the environment, not the internal thing itself.
But that has to be something internal. And you know what I mean? Like, I'd like to argue with that. I think where else it's not external. It's not grown outside of
I wasn't saying I agreed with that.
I know.
But he is challenging the way we traditionally think.
And it's a good challenge because it doesn't.
Yeah.
That's really deeply saying.
And and what I like is, as Patrick has said all the way through, it's about language. It's about challenging the words we use to describe these things. And that's what he's doing, I feel. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I'm in general agreement. One of the reasons why I asked you to read that, I forget the author's